Every Sunday after church, my mother left the house at exactly 4 in the afternoon. She said she was visiting a grave. She did this for 26 years without missing a single week. I never questioned it because grief deserves privacy. After she died, I followed her route for the first time. She didn't turn toward the cemetery. She turned onto a quiet street I had never seen before. She stopped in front of a small house. When the door opened, the man standing there looked exactly like my father. The same eyes, the same posture, the same silence. Except my father was supposed to have been dead for 30 years. And in that moment, I realized my mother hadn't been visiting the dead. She had been protecting the living. If you find comfort in quiet stories like this, you're always welcome here. If this story stayed with you, you might like the others too. You can subscribe anytime. Every Sunday in our house followed the same pattern. Church in the morning, lunch at 1, silence after 3, and at exactly 4 in the afternoon, my mother would stand up, pick up her handbag, and say the same words she had said for as long as I could remember. "I'm going to the cemetery." She never asked anyone to come with her. She never stayed longer than an hour. She didn't dress in black or cry before leaving. It was said calmly, like a responsibility that no longer needed emotion attached to it. My father had died when I was 12. A car accident on a wet road. That's what I was told. My mother never spoke badly about him. She also never spoke much about him at all. His photograph stayed on the wall. His clothes disappeared slowly. His name was mentioned only when necessary. I learned early that some grief lives quietly, and you don't interrupt it. For 26 years, she went every Sunday. Rain, heat, holidays. Even once, when she had a fever, she still left at 4 and returned just before 5, smelling faintly of the same soap she always used. I assumed routine was her way of surviving. As I got older, I stopped noticing. Her leaving became background noise in my life. Something stable, something predictable. In a world where people change, her Sunday visits felt permanent. Looking back now, I realize how much trust we place in repetition. When something happens the same way long enough, we stop asking why. We mistake consistency for truth. I didn't know then that the routine I respected was not built on mourning. It was built on protection. And the person being protected wasn't the dead. When my father died, no one explained much. Adults lowered their voices. Neighbors brought food. Teachers looked at me differently. I learned quickly that questions made people uncomfortable, so I stopped asking them. Silence became a skill, something I carried with me into adulthood without realizing it. My mother never cried in front of me. If she cried at all, she did it behind closed doors. On Sundays, when she returned from the cemetery, she would wash her hands, change her shoes, and continue the evening as if nothing unusual had happened. Dinner, television, bed. That calmness taught me something dangerous. It taught me that love survives best when it isn't examined too closely. I tried once when I was still young to ask her what she did at the cemetery for so long. She smiled gently and said, "Some conversations are private, even with the people we love." I accepted that answer without resentment. It felt respectful. It felt grown up. I didn't understand then how easily respect can become distance. As years passed, my life filled with its own routines. Work, marriage, children. But every Sunday at 4, no matter where I was, I pictured my mother walking the same familiar path, carrying a grief I believed I understood. That image anchored my idea of her. Faithful, loyal, quietly devoted to a memory. After she died, that image remained intact for exactly 1 week, until the Sunday arrived. 4 o'clock came and went, and for the first time in my life, my mother didn't leave. That absence felt louder than her presence ever had. The first Sunday after my mother's funeral felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. The house was full of people, then suddenly empty. By mid-afternoon, the silence settled in the same way it always did before she left. At 3:30, I caught myself listening for her footsteps. At 4, I looked toward the door out of habit. She didn't move. Of course she didn't, and yet my body expected it. That was the moment I realized how deeply her routine had shaped my sense of time. Sundays weren't measured by clocks in our house. They were measured by her leaving and returning. Without that movement, the day felt unfinished, like a sentence without punctuation. I stood up at 4:10 and did something I had never done before. I picked up my keys. I told myself I was just going for a drive. There was no plan, no curiosity I was willing to admit yet. I followed the route she always took, turning left at the bakery, passing the park where children played every weekend. My hands moved on the steering wheel as if they remembered the way on their own. Halfway there, I noticed something I had never questioned before. This road didn't lead to the cemetery. I slowed down, my chest tightening as the realization settled. The cemetery was 2 miles in the opposite direction. Always had been. I had driven past it dozens of times for work. There was no confusion possible. My mother had not been visiting a grave. I pulled over and sat there for several minutes, engine running, trying to convince myself there was an explanation that didn't change everything. But deep down, something had already shifted. The routine I trusted had cracked open, and there was no way to put it back together. I almost turned back. Knowing something and proving it are two very different acts. One preserves peace, the other demands courage. I sat there longer than I care to admit, weighing the comfort of ignorance against the cost of truth. Then I drove on. The street was quiet, the kind of place people pass without noticing. Small houses, trim lawns, no sidewalks. I had never had a reason to be there before. My mother slowed down here every Sunday. I remembered that now. I remembered how she would straighten her posture, how her face would settle into something serious but not sad. She stopped in front of a pale blue house with a narrow porch. No flowers, no decorations, just clean windows and a closed door. I parked across the street, heart pounding, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. I watched the house as if it might explain itself. After a minute, the door opened. A man stepped outside, glanced up and down the street, then leaned against the railing. He was older than my father would have been, and yet somehow exactly the same. The shape of his shoulders, the way he held his hands, the stillness. It was as if time had paused for him in a way it never had for the rest of us. I couldn't breathe. My first instinct was denial. Faces repeat. Memory exaggerates. Grief invents connections. But my body didn't argue. My body knew. The man looked directly at my car, not with surprise, with recognition. And in that moment, I understood something I wasn't ready to name yet. My mother hadn't been lying to me out of fear. She had been protecting a truth that required absolute silence to survive. My hand tightened around the steering wheel. Every part of me wanted to start the engine and leave. Whatever this was, it didn't belong to me. It belonged to the past, to my parents, to choices made long before I had any say in them. The man remained on the porch, as if he was waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. I realized then that my mother must have been on a schedule because he was. This meeting wasn't accidental. It was coordinated, practiced, and protected by time. I thought of my mother walking up those steps every Sunday, sitting inside that house, speaking in the careful way she always had. I wondered what name she used for him. I wondered what name he used for her. Some relationships exist only in the spaces they are given. After a few minutes, the door opened again. This time, a woman appeared beside him, younger than him, older than me. She said something I couldn't hear and he nodded. Then she looked straight at my car. There was no mistaking it. Her eyes widened slightly, not in fear but in realization. She leaned closer to him and whispered something urgent. His posture changed. He stood straighter. I started the car. As I pulled away, my hands were shaking. I wasn't running from danger. I was running from confirmation. Once I crossed a certain line, there would be no way to pretend this was coincidence. That night, I barely slept. Images replayed in my mind. The house, the man, the woman, and the quiet certainty that my father's death had been a story carefully told, not an event that had actually happened. I didn't confront anyone the next day. I went to work. I answered emails. I nodded in meetings. But my mind stayed fixed on that house, on the man who looked too familiar to be a stranger. I needed something solid. Memory could lie. Paper usually didn't. That evening, I opened the old filing cabinet in my mother's room. It hadn't been touched since she moved to assisted living years earlier. Inside were neatly labeled folders. Insurance, taxes, medical records. The order comforted me. My mother had always believed control came from organization. I found my father's death certificate in a brown envelope. I had seen it before, but never closely. This time, details stood out. The date was correct. The location was vague. Too vague. No hospital listed. No doctor's signature I recognized. Just enough information to be official. Not enough to be specific. I pulled out old bank statements. There were withdrawals every Sunday afternoon for decades. Same amount, same time. I had always assumed they were for flowers, or donations, or nothing worth examining. Now they looked like something else. A system. A promise kept quietly. At the bottom of the drawer, I found a folded letter in my mother's handwriting. Sealed but never sent. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply began with the words, "If this ever comes out." I didn't read further. Some truths resist being rushed. But I knew then that what I had seen wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a life carefully hidden in plain sight. The letter sat on the table, its unopened words pressing against my curiosity. I could feel the weight of its secrets, the kind that had been tucked away for decades. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, each crease revealing a history I had never known. The handwriting was unmistakable, my mother's careful script, the one that had penned countless notes and lists, now carried a confession. She wrote about a man she met before she married my father, a man whose presence lingered long after their paths had diverged. She spoke of choices made out of necessity, of promises kept in silence. As I read, the world around me faded. The words described a relationship that predated the life I knew. My mother had kept him in her life in small, hidden ways, maintaining a connection that had never fully ended. The letter revealed a love that had been overshadowed by the life she built with my father. It explained the Sunday visits. It explained the routine. Every detail aligned with what I had observed. And yet, the truth felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit until now. My father's death, the official records, and the quiet Sundays were all part of a larger story of compromise and sacrifice. I felt a mix of emotions: betrayal, sadness, and a strange sense of understanding. The letter wasn't just a confession. It was a testament to the complexity of human relationships and the ways we hide truths to protect the ones we love. As the evening turned to night, I put the letter back in its place. The secrets it held would take time to process, but one thing was clear. The past was never as simple as it seemed. I went back the following Sunday, not at 4, earlier. I parked farther down the street and waited, watching the pale blue house the way someone watches a storm approach, knowing they can't stop it. At 3:50, the door opened. The same man stepped out slower this time. Age had caught up with him in small ways, but it hadn't softened his presence. A few seconds later, the woman I had seen before joined him. She looked directly toward where my car was hidden, and didn't look away. She came to me. She knocked lightly on my window. Not startled, not angry. When I rolled it down, she said my name. Not a question. A statement. She told me she had been expecting me, that my mother had prepared her for this moment, that some truths were never meant to stay buried forever, only delayed until the right person was ready to hear them. I asked her who the man was. She didn't hesitate. She said, "He's the one your mother never stopped protecting." In that instant, I understood why my mother's Sundays were sacred, why she never invited anyone along, why grief was the safest explanation she could offer. Because grief closes doors. The truth would have blown them wide open. That night, I said my father's name out loud for the first time in years, not as a memory, as a question. It felt strange in my mouth, like a word that no longer belonged to the past. I realized how carefully my mother had trained me to think of him as finished, complete, resolved. Death is easier than absence. Death has rules. Absence does not. I wondered if he knew about me, if he had watched me grow from a distance, if my life had been something he followed silently, the way my mother followed him every Sunday. Sleep didn't come. Morning did. The next Sunday I went back. Same street, same house. I parked closer this time. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was heavy, like it already knew the outcome. The man opened the door before I knocked. He looked older in daylight, more fragile, but when he looked at me, something in his eyes softened in a way that felt practiced. "I wondered when you'd come," he said. That was the moment denial ended. He didn't invite me in right away. We stood on the porch, two people connected by blood and silence. He told me my mother used to sit in the same chair every week. Same time, same questions, same restraint. She wanted you to have a normal life, he said. She wanted you untouched by what we couldn't fix. I asked him why he never came for me. He said, because loving you from a distance was the only way I was allowed to. They never divorced. They never reconciled. My father had disappeared legally to protect someone else. A mistake, a threat, a life interrupted. The details didn't matter as much as the outcome. Staying dead was safer than coming back. My mother chose routine over chaos, silence over scandal, stability over truth, and I grew up believing loss instead of complexity. Anger didn't come right away. It arrived days later, quiet, controlled. I was angry at my mother for deciding my reality without my consent, angry at my father for accepting a life where I existed only in shadows. But underneath the anger was something heavier. Understanding. They hadn't chosen happiness. They had chosen least damage. For the first time, I saw my mother clearly, not as a quiet widow, not as a woman frozen in grief, but as someone carrying an impossible balance, protecting a child, protecting a man, protecting a truth that could destroy them both. Her Sundays weren't about loss. They were about responsibility. She knew the moment I learned the truth, I would feel divided, loyal to one parent, curious about the other, pulled apart by questions that had no clean answers. She chose certainty over confusion for me. She chose to carry the confusion herself. I started visiting, not every Sunday, not on a schedule, just when I needed to understand where I came from. We didn't try to make up for lost time. We respected it. Some relationships aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be acknowledged. I went back to the cemetery. I stood in front of the gravestone and realized it had never been a lie. It was a symbol, not of death, but of an ending my mother needed the world to accept. Grief had been the safest disguise. I never asked my mother if she regretted it. I already knew the answer. Regret assumes better options existed. For her, they didn't. She did what kept everyone standing. Silence isn't emptiness. It's weight. It's care. It's a decision made every day not to speak, even when speaking would be easier. My mother spoke through routine instead of words. On the anniversary of her death, I went to the house at 4 o'clock. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We sat with the quiet she had left behind. For the first time, the hour felt complete. I don't explain this story to everyone. Some truths aren't meant to be shared loudly. They're meant to be held carefully. I understand now why my mother lived the way she did. My mother wasn't visiting the dead. She was protecting the living. And now, so am I. Even now I replay those Sundays in my head. I see my mother walking toward that pale blue house, carrying decades of secrets in her calm posture. I see her sitting on the porch, speaking quietly to the man she never stopped loving. I feel the weight of responsibility she carried. Protecting a life, a love, a truth that could never fully be shared. Her silence wasn't absence, it was devotion. Every careful step, every measured word, every routine repeated for 26 years was a gift. I didn't understand until she was gone. Started visiting the Blue House more often. I would sit in my car across the street, watching them move in quiet harmony. The man my father never acknowledged me outright at first. The woman beside him, his niece, spoke softly. Guiding interactions, I observed small rituals, the way they drank tea together, the way the blinds were adjusted, the faint smell of lavender that lingered from her small garden. They were ordinary moments, yet I could feel the extraordinary weight of decades of hidden life in every glance. Slowly, I began to understand the rhythm of their existence, their quiet way of keeping a fractured life together without shattering mine. One day, I approached him, not for answers, not for confrontation, just to exist in the same space. He looked at me with eyes that held both recognition and regret. "You've grown into her strength," he said quietly. I didn't know what to answer. Words felt clumsy. "How do you thank someone for existing in a shadow you never knew was cast?" He continued. "She made sure you never had to bear this burden. That was always her choice. I respect that." In that moment, I understood what love really meant. Sacrifice, protection, restraint, not grand gestures, not confessions, Just quiet devotion carried over decades. Visiting them taught me patience. Not the kind measured in minutes or hours, but the kind measured in decades. I saw how lives can exist side by side without ever fully intersecting, how love can be hidden but still real, how care can speak louder than words. It made me reflect on my own choices, my own relationships. How often do we try to force clarity instead of allowing time to reveal what is meant to be seen? Months later, I finally opened the letter my mother had left. The one that explained so much yet said so little directly. Her words weren't a confession. They were instructions, guidance. She wrote about trust, about letting truths reveal themselves gradually, about protecting lives in the way only she could. Reading it, I felt a mixture of awe and sorrow. Awe for the careful life she managed, sorrow for the decades of silence she bore alone. I began sitting with my father and the woman beside him, without fear. We didn't rush into deep conversations. We didn't need to. Just sharing the same room, the same moments. Created a bridge one afternoon. He told me about his childhood memories, about the roads he drove, about the regrets he carried. We laughed quietly at small absurdities, like noticing the way the wind shifted in their garden. It was simple, it was ordinary, and yet it carried the weight of a lifetime of untold stories. Asked them why my mother chose exactly Sunday at 4. They laughed softly, not a cruel laugh, but one filled with decades of shared understanding. It was the hour when the world slowed, my father said. The hour when she could ensure everything she loved was safe. And I realized then, my mother had mastered the art of quiet guardianship. She didn't just protect secrets, she protected hearts. I began to accept the past, not because it was simple, but because it was inevitable. I could no longer measure grief or truth by absolutes. Life isn't fair. People aren't perfect. Choices are made in the shadows. And sometimes, those shadows protect the light. I forgave my mother silently. I forgave my father silently. And slowly, I forgave myself for ever questioning the quiet that had carried me through childhood. Now, I keep a small tradition of my own. I visit the house occasionally, not to demand answers, but to honor the lives that existed in parallel. The love, the protection, the decades of careful silence. I've learned that some truths aren't meant to shatter, but to coexist, that love can survive in hidden corners, that sacrifice can be invisible but real. And as I drive back home, I remember my mother's steps on those quiet streets, carrying not only her own life but mine as well. If this story stayed with you, you might like the others too. You can subscribe anytime. Time didn't make things easier. It only taught us where to place the pain so it wouldn't interrupt daily life. I learned that from my mother without realizing it. And now, sitting in that same quiet house, I understood she had mastered something most people never do. She didn't erase the past. She arranged it carefully so it wouldn't collapse the present. I noticed how my father moved through rooms slowly, deliberately, like someone who had learned not to expect too much from space. His life had been paused, not ended, and when a life pauses, it doesn't restart loudly. It resumes quietly. One afternoon, he told me about the job he almost took in another state, the house he almost bought, the road trips he planned but never took. These weren't complaints. They were inventory. Like someone listing belongings lost in a fire without expecting compensation. He said, "Your mother didn't take my life from me. She saved yours by giving up mine." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. I used to think love was presence. Then I thought it was sacrifice. Now I realize it's adaptation. Love changes shape when circumstances demand it. My parents didn't stop loving each other. They simply reshaped love into something quieter, safer, less visible. And that invisible love raised me. Protection has a cost. I paid it without knowing. Not in trauma, but in absence. There were questions I never learned to ask. Emotions I didn't know how to name. When you grow up in a carefully controlled silence, you don't notice the missing sounds until much later. I wasn't angry, but I was grieving something I never had the chance to miss. As weeks passed, stories emerged naturally, not confessions, memories. My father spoke about my childhood, milestones as if he had been there, because in some way he had, through updates, through observation, through my mother's careful retelling. He knew me without knowing me. One evening, I imagined my mother driving home after those visits, sitting in traffic, staring straight ahead, preparing herself to return to a life where she couldn't mention the hour she had just lived. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It just survives. People assume truth should always be immediate, but timing matters. Truth delivered too early can damage what it's meant to heal. My mother didn't hide the truth because she didn't trust me. She delayed it because she loved me. Love sometimes chooses postponement over honesty. I stopped feeling like an intruder at the Blue House. I became part of its stillness. We shared meals. We shared silence. We shared moments that didn't need explanation. Not every relationship needs a dramatic beginning to be real. Who was I now? The child of a man who lived in the shadows? Or the child of a woman who controlled light and darkness with equal care? Identity isn't rewritten in one moment. It adjusts slowly. I didn't lose who I was, I expanded. No one asked for forgiveness. No one offered apologies. They weren't needed. This wasn't a story about wrongdoing. It was a story about impossible choices made under pressure. Forgiveness arrived quietly, like understanding. One day I realized I wasn't searching for more information anymore. I had enough. Answers stop mattering when acceptance begins. I no longer needed timelines or explanations. I needed peace. The truth didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a responsibility, not to hide it, not to reveal it recklessly, but to respect it. Some stories deserve careful handling. This was one of them. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition. It shows up consistently. Every Sunday, every decision, every silence chosen deliberately. My mother was the strongest person I have ever known. Knowing this story changed how I lived mine. I spoke more carefully. I listened longer. I stopped assuming people's silence meant emptiness. Often it means depth. Love doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It waits. It adapts. It survives in routines, glances, and quiet hours the world doesn't notice. My parents proved that. My mother didn't leave me wealth or instructions. She left me perspective, the ability to see complexity without fear, to accept that life is rarely clean. That legacy mattered more than truth delivered early. I tell this story not to expose the past, but to honor it, because somewhere, someone else is living inside a silence they don't yet understand. And maybe they'll realize, like I did, that sometimes love doesn't make noise. It just stays.
If you find comfort in quiet stories like this, you're always welcome here. If this story stayed with you, you might like the others too. You can subscribe anytime.